10. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the SAME Environmental Community of Interest Industry Government Engagement Project webinar, a reintroduction to PFAS. My name is Rick Weiss with Patel, and I'm going to moderate today's event. A couple of housekeeping notes and tips. If you're connected through a VPN, you may have difficulties. I know I'm on a VPN, hope I don't. You broadcast through your computer speakers. If you use the chat tab, you can chat with the group. But if you have questions and answers for the presenters, please use the Q&A tab. I will be basically noting the Q&A and asking those questions later. If you like a handout for today's presentation, please go to the handout tab, which you should see on your screen, and feel free to, get a handout of this thing. We're also going to post materials on the SAME ECOI website. So if you are interested in this program or others, I invite you to go to the SAME How to Get Involved, Community of Interest, Environmental, ECOI. And also note that SAME is going to be updating the website soon. It'll be much easier to navigate through. Okay, so there'll be a poll question opened for everybody. We'd like to have an understanding of who's on the call today, where if you're active duty military, a business, academic, or retired. So please take a moment and answer the poll question. And our speakers today, I'm the moderator, Rick Weiss, and we have two great speakers today. Bill Giuseppe with Jacobs is a PFAS subject matter expert, nationally known and within his firm, a leader there. And Lisa Kramer with Western Solutions is a PFAS leader within her firm, and they put together today's presentation. Today's agenda is basically an overview of various topics within PFAS reintroduction. And here's a list of the topics, and Bill's going to describe a little bit more of the IGE program. He is the project manager for the IGE program. I put in the chat Bill's email address and my own should you want more information. You could also reach us by going to the SAME website ECOI page. And I'm not going to get into the details there. The learning objectives for today basically learn a little bit more about the ECOI IGE program, an overview of PFAS history, nomenclature, chemistry, and regulation, and get an introduction to some other PFAS topics, sampling analysis, mobility risk assessment, and treatment of PFAS. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Bill Giuseppe.
Thanks, Rick. One of the things we want to do here is introduce this industry government engagement project within the SAME Environmental Community of Interest. And one of the questions you might have been asking is, why do we need yet another PFAS thing, webinar or whatever? Because I think we're all suffering a little bit of PFAS information overload. And the reasoning here was that there is a ton of information out there. If you want to get the 800-page gorilla of information, you go to ITRC, tons of information, whatever. But it's a bit overwhelming to a lot of people. And so what we wanted to do was create a program of a series of webinars and fact sheets and other information that kind of distills down and targets and tailors the information into sort of digestible little pieces for the DoD personnel and contractors, because everybody's addressing this in different ways. And again, there's a lot of information out there, but it's sometimes too much information. So we put this program together, and I'm leading this, but we also have, whoops, sorry, this popped up. Sorry, the poll popped up for me. But anyway, so we have a bunch of advisors from DoD that we appreciate their input in reviewing the information and providing us guidance on how to prioritize information. So Ramona Irie from NAVFAC, Bonnie Packer, Army National Guard, Steve Greigert from the Corps in Omaha, and Anita Meyer from Corps EMCX have all assisted in preparing the slides, and we really appreciate that. We also have a really big team of folks, consultants, labs, vendors, technology owners, et cetera, some DoD, Army folks in here as well. And this group is helping prepare the information and prioritize and pick the topics and that sort of thing. So if you are interested in supporting the IGE, contributing and helping us prepare materials, please send me an email and I'll add you to the list. We have calls periodically, and we have an agenda on what's coming for that. Our goal overall, our work products are kind of threefold. We will have some sort of timely regulatory fact sheets or information that we present. Like for instance, in December, I presented a summary of the EPA's strategic roadmap. We will have 1-hour webinars like this one, which will be COI sponsored events with different speakers all the time on the individual topics. And then we might have sort of spontaneous briefs if during the monthly calls for the environmental COI, if a topic comes up, we will present information there as well. So then our scheduled topics, we did the roadmap summary back in December. This call is the reintroduction to PFAS. The next one, we'll do them every quarter. So the next one will be towards the end of March, early April, and it'll be on analytical chemistry and sampling considerations. And then we will have one 3 months later on regulatory drivers and sort of what other groups are doing related to PFAS outside of DoD to learn more about what the industry is doing. And then mobility and conceptual site models, and then treatment alternatives, and then PFAS waste generation, waste management, and disposal, and then some cost and performance data for water and soil treatment for PFAS. So knowing these are quarterly, those last couple are going to be in 2023. So appreciate everybody's interest in the IGE. And again, if you have if you want to join, accompany us, or have suggestions, please let me know. So now I'll turn it over to Lisa Kammer from Weston, who's going to take the lead on the rest of the presentation. You're muted, Lisa.
It's supposed to unmute you.
There we go. Yep, you're on.
Thanks, everybody. It's really good to be here, and I'm happy to do this reintroduction on PFAS. As Bill mentioned, there is a overwhelming amount of information you can find online, so hopefully this is a nice, concise package for everybody. Jumping right into it, we're going to go through a little bit about the history of PFAS. A lot of people will know this already, so bear with me. In the 30s, PFAS were discovered, and we understood that they had water, soil, stain, and oil resistance. They demonstrated chemical and thermal stability, and they're produced by two primary processes: electrochemical fluorination and then fluorotelomerization. And there's some importance about those two production methods that we'll talk about a little bit later on. By the 1950s, PFAS were used pretty much worldwide in a bunch of different applications, both industrial and consumer related. But it wasn't until the 1970s that it was discovered that there was an exposure issue related to those people who were working in manufacturing facilities with PFAS. And at that time also in 1970, DoD began using PFAS containing AFFF as well. By the 1990s, it was discovered that regardless of whether or not you worked in a facility that used or manufactured PFAS containing materials, you would probably have PFAS in your blood. And that was something of a surprise. And at that time, researchers had to go back to blood samples from before the Korean War to find blood samples that didn't have PFAS in them. By the 2000s, there was a voluntary phase out of PFAS by certain manufacturers in the United States. And then the Stockholm Convention, which is a UN treaty signed by the EU, aimed to limit certain contaminants as well. Moving into the 2010s, there began some initial assessments. UCMR3 began an analysis of public water supplies to understand, what were the prevalence of certain PFAS in public water supplies. And At that time, also reporting limits were higher than they are now. So something to keep in mind when, referencing back to that UCMR3. In 2016, EPA issued a lifetime health advisory of 70 parts per trillion for PFOA and PFAS individually or combined. While concurrent to that, a lot of states were moving forward with their own regulations ahead of EPA. In 2021, EPA issued their strategic roadmap, which Bill gave the outline of that in December. It outlines a bunch of different efforts to regulate PFAS under CERCLA. And then EPA also recognized afterward that they would look at regulating PFAS under RCRA as well. They also indicated that they would be completing UCMR 5, which includes 29 PFAS compounds versus the 2 that were included in UCMR 3. Talking about potential sources of PFAS, they're pretty wide and varied, so this is just sort of a general categorization of the potential sources. Pulp and paper mills are going to be a potential source from their coatings and their paper products, your restaurant takeaway containers. There's a reason why you don't get grease on your hands when you're holding your burger, partially wrapped still. Fabric and leather coatings, everybody's aware of, Gore-Tex and Stainmaster carpets, outdoor gear, clothing, Scotchgard, things like that. Anything that imparts oil, water, dirt repellency is going to likely contain PFAS. And then chrome plating at commercial and military facilities is another issue for dust suppression. And it's interesting because in California, PFAS became an initial concern because of the chrome plating facilities and the dust suppression issues there. So it actually came through their air group rather than their drinking water and surface water group. Municipal solid waste landfills would be the next obvious potential source. All of these consumer goods that we have, they get old and break or whatever, and we throw them away. And then they end up in the landfills, and there's, runoff and leachate issues. Similarly, wastewater treatment plants were excreting PFAS pretty regularly. So it ends up in the wastewater treatment plant through stack emissions and biosolids, and then those biosolids get applied to agricultural fields, and end up going back through the food chain that way. And through the plant uptake, and then also any animals that might be grazing on those fields. So it can have pretty detrimental agricultural effects as well. And then, of course, everybody's favorite, AFFF, Class B firefighting foams. They'll be applied at a crash site regardless of whether there's a fire. It's sprayed if there's not a fire as a preventative measure. And then you have maintenance and testing of the fire suppression systems as well, including the trucks and all of that. Refineries and bulk terminals, similarly, they'll have fire suppression systems. Different than DOD though, refineries and bulk terminals may have already switched over to fluorine-free foams. But if they have secondary containment structures that are concrete, you're going to have that legacy foam where they've done their testing. Even if they haven't had a fire, they'll have done testing, and it'll seep into the concrete, and that serves as an ongoing source as well. So there can be a lot of different types of PFAS that you can find at one facility. Pause for a drink here. So moving on to how we talk about PFAS, it's all in the names. They're a big mouthful when you hear them spelled out, not using the acronyms. And they're a big mouthful. There's also a lot of them to talk about. So they've been organized into the structure. There's more than 10,000, I think, at this point. The latest numbers are well beyond 4,700. But when we talk about PFAS as it relates to the environmental work, we're typically talking about the non-polymer class of PFAS compounds. They're the ones that are most commonly present in the environment. And the two most well-known PFAS compounds are PFOA and PFAS. They are in this non-polymer grouping. under perfluoroalkyl substances and under the PFAS, or the perfluoroalkyl acids. The difference between per and polyfluoroalkyl substances relates to whether or not the carbons are fully bonded to only fluorine. Per is a fully fluorinated compound, and poly is only a partially fluorinated compound. So diving into the names of the PFCAs and the PFSAs, PFCAs are carboxylates and PFSAs are sulfonates. We talk about whether it's a perfluorobutanoic acid, octanoic acid, or decanoic acid is based on the number of fluorinated carbons in that chain. So if you have 4 carbons that are fluorinated, it's going to use the buta in the name. So perfluorobutanoic acid, you have 4 fully fluorinated carbons there. Similar for 8 and 10. So the example here is PFOA, or perfluorooctanoic acid. You have this carbon fluorine tail, that's the long tail where all the carbons are. And then you have this charged functional group at the end, and this serves as being the weak point in the molecule. And we can talk about that in a little bit here, but this is showing you the 8 fully fluorinated carbons, or perfluorooctanoic acid. For federal regulations, so PFAS aren't regulated federally at this point. Under the Safe Water Drinking Act, EPA issued a lifetime health advisory of 70 parts per trillion for both PFOA and PFAS, and that's individual or combined. And these are lifetime health advisories are non-enforceable and non-regulatory values. And as I mentioned before, as part of the strategic roadmap, EPA does have a proposal for a regulatory determination for PFOA and PFAS in drinking water. But currently, there are no PFAS that are regulated under CERCLA or RCRA. They're not designated hazardous substances or wastes, although, again, that is in process under the strategic roadmap. Under TSCA, the significant new use rule, there's some restrictions on the manufacture, use, and import of long-chain PFAS, but it's not all-encompassing of all PFAS. So there's some potential loopholes there that could be closed. You have the toxic release inventory that includes 172 PFAS compounds right now. And right now, as of right now, DoD still requires the use of fluorinated AFFF, but is currently working on identifying a fluorine-free mil-spec option. And that we'll talk about again a little bit later. Food and Drug Administration. So I mentioned before that there's a reason why you don't get grease on your hands when you're eating your burger. They are regulating PFAS used to make grease-proofing food packaging, and a lot of companies you might have seen on the news are moving away from PFAS-containing food packaging as well. One of the issues you have to consider too, though, not to get too in the weeds about it, but some of the issues when people or organizations start going away from using PFAS, they might be using alternatives, which are usually shorter chain PFAS compounds, which aren't necessarily better. So there's a little bit of like a misunderstanding when they say we no longer use PFAS. So just a little FYI there. Under the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, there are no federal air or water quality standards for PFAS of any kind. There are some sampling methodologies that have sampling and analysis methodologies for air that have come out recently. And then again, the strategic roadmap that came out in 2021, and it details plans over the next 3 years that explains a whole of EPA agency approach to addressing PFAS in the environment and reducing human exposure. And they're looking to research more of PFAS, restrict PFAS, and then remediate PFAS as well. And they're also going to address whether the PFAS will be looked at individually or in classes. And regulations of PFAS specifically PFOA and PFAS under CERCLA, and they'll be developing MCLs as well. And then in a response to, I think it was the state of New Mexico, EPA indicated that they would evaluate PFOA and PFAS under RCRA as well, which is a pretty significant undertaking. And then finally, they'll be looking at some of the past strategies that have been employed at sites to confirm whether or not they're still protective in the context of PFAS as well. So various states have moved on ahead of EPA, recognizing that it was probably a bigger situation and needed to be addressed at a quicker pace. So states were able to move forward with a lot of different types of regulations. And we've seen it a lot in the Northeast, and it's slowly starting to spread across the United States, out west as well. So right now, the majority of states that do regulate PFAS are regulating it in water and soil. But surface water, biosolids, air, and other media are coming right up after that. So there's a lot of activity in the states as they start looking at different types of regulations as well. And I'll put in a plug for ITRC's Water and Soil Values Table. It's a table that's updated regularly with different states, federal agencies, and international water and soil values table. And when you get the slide deck and you download it, these are active hyperlinks that you can click on. And then hazardous waste and hazardous substance designations are really pretty critical in addressing PFAS, and multiple states have designated them as hazardous waste or substances already. And then consumer protection rules that are in place include California, New York, Maine, and Washington that requires different kinds of labeling and consumer protection. In Maine, for example, you see a lot of milk and dairy products like butter that'll have labels on it that'll indicate that it's been tested for PFAS, and that's going back to the biosolids that are used on the fields that the cows then graze on. There were, I can't even tell you how many millions of gallons of milk that had to be destroyed because it had PFAS in it that was at levels that were not considered safe. Herds of cows that have been culled because of it. So it's a pretty significant issue for consumers and also for the economy and the farmers. So when we start moving into state regulation, this map really demonstrates what I was saying before, in that a lot of the initial regulations have been coming from the Northeast. You see that by the orange color, which indicates that those states have promulgated MCLs, drinking water standards. The blue color is a screening or guidance value in water, and then the yellow color are states that have formally indicated that they are following the EPA health advisory, while the states that are gray they might be following the EPA health advisory, or they might be taking no action, but either way, it hasn't been stated explicitly in any kind of regulatory format. So you see a lot of action happening here. I think once EPA makes a determination for PFOA and PFAS, I think a lot of this is going to get interesting with some of the states that have very low standards and some that are still waiting to see what happens. This table demonstrates just some of the changes that have happened. You see back here in 2009, EPA had a value of 200 nanograms per liter or parts per trillion. And then in 2016, they promulgated that, it's not promulgated, sorry, it's they issued the EPA health advisory, lifetime health advisory of 70 parts per trillion for PFOA and PFAS. So you can see it was quite a big jump. And then since that time, states have rolled out different numbers. For example, Massachusetts was following 70 parts per trillion, I think initially for 5 compounds, and then at the end of 2019, they they promulgated their standards for 6 different PFAS compounds at 20 parts per trillion for the individual or the combined compounds. So you see a lot of different changes happening amongst the states that are doing the regulating already. And similarly for soils, or maybe it's dissimilarly, soils are a little bit farther behind than water. And so you do see a lot of promulgation happening in the Northeast and then slowly making its way west. The difference in colors here, green is for the protection of human health, blue is protection of surface water and groundwater, while orange is both protection of surface water and groundwater and human health. So you can see that there are quite a few states that are making headway in the soil regulations as well. And for demonstration purposes, this table does a good job at showing you the various levels of soil concentrations that are protective of human health at the top, and then protective of drinking water and groundwater down at the bottom. You can see the significant difference in the values there. They don't even show up on the map or on the graph for the protection of drinking water and groundwater. So what are we talking about here when we're talking about parts per trillion? A lot of us, if outside of the environmental field, if we know anything about contaminants, we're usually used to hearing about them in parts per million or parts per billion. But PFAS, it's parts per trillion, and in some cases, people are talking about them in parts per quadrillion, which is even lower. But what that is demonstrated here. So if we have 1 part per trillion of a PFAS compound, we're talking about 1 inch in 16 million miles, or 1 penny in $10 billion. So, if you're talking about parts per quadrillion, you're just adding another set of zeros behind that, right? It's a lot. For physical and chemical properties, this is what really makes PFAS unique. In a lot of ways, it's still a contaminant like any other we might be dealing with, but for these very reasons that we're going to talk about now, they're very unique, and they present different challenges for us in the environmental world. So, they have these great properties that have made it so that they are, so prevalent in our lives. They can exist in many different states, whether it's a positive charge, a negative charge, or both positive and a negative charge. They have a range of pH values that they'll like. It's usually from a pH of 4 to 10. They have, in general, a low vapor pressure and Henry's law constant, so they wouldn't tend to volatilize, although there are volatile PFAS. They're also very water soluble, so they're mobile and they're persistent, and many are believed to be bioaccumulative. They get in that water and they run. But it's that size of the tail. So again, we're talking about the fully fluorinated, in this case, carbon tail that will sort of dictate how it moves in the environment. So if it's got the longer tail, it's more hydrophobic, and it can make it move slower in water. And the other thing about that is that you have a hydrophobic tail, which means that it doesn't like water, and you have the hydrophilic head that does like water. So that'll allow it to line up at different interfaces, whether it's air, water, or soil, water. So that impacts some of the approaches that we might take in the environmental community, and how we look for it, how we address it. And then again, talking about carboxylates and sulfonates, if you remember back to the nomenclature slide, we had non-polymers, and then we went down all the way on the left there under PFAS, or perfluoroalkyl acids. There were PFCAs, perfluorocarboxylic acids, and PFSAs, perfluorosulfonates. And that's where we're talking about now. The carboxylates will tend to move faster than the sulfonates. So how they move in the environment, all of those properties that we talked about on the slide before dictate how they move in the environment. And it's, as I mentioned, the head and the tail will allow for PFAS to do some partitioning at that soil water, air water, or NAPL water interface. And then the PFAS, which include the sulfonates and the carboxylic acids, are typically present in that anionic form, and they're relatively mobile in groundwater and tend to stick to any kind of organic carbon that might be in the soils and sediments that are present as well. So again, I mentioned that the longer tails have slower mobility, stronger absorption to soil. The sulfonates have a stronger absorption than the carboxylates, where the linear isomers have stronger absorption than the branched isomers. And when I talked about at the very beginning about the two different production methods, ECF and fluorotelomerization, I mentioned that that has implications later on in the slide, or in the slide deck, and that's here. You have the production of linear isomers here on the right, on the bottom molecule demonstrated here. That's a linear isomer. And then you have branched isomers right here on top, and I have a circle around that branch. And that's those production methods produce these different types of molecules, and they have different properties about them. So you can still be talking about PFOS, but how it behaves in the environment might change based on how it was produced. And then you have typical transport mechanisms as well. So normal environmental work, normal environmental contaminants, we're talking about advection, dispersion, diffusion, deposition, and leaching. And those same mechanisms apply to PFAS, but how they disperse and how they diffuse and how they leach and all of that change based on those physiochemical properties that we just talked about. All right, one more drink. Getting a little bit of vocal fry. So sampling and analysis. And I should mention too, some of the stuff that we're talking about will be part of a bigger presentation later on. So I'm really only hitting the highlights of it. And this is one of those. Sampling and analysis, there's a lot of this, because PFAS are everywhere, so they end up in a sampling equipment that we might use to do groundwater sampling, soil sampling, and they're measured at ultra low target concentrations as well. So what do we end up with? We try to avoid anything with Tyvek, Teflon, any new unwashed clothing, any fast food wrappers, nonstick, anything, Teflon, anything. And so what that means is that, we might have a specific area where people will go and eat, they'll drink, they'll wash their hands, they'll get out of their Tyvek, then they'll come back and they'll wash their hands and they'll get back into something else. Sorry, not Tyvek. Any kind of uncoated material is okay. And then acceptable stuff, HDPE, high density polyethylene or polypropylene sample containers, nitrile gloves, any kind of natural fibers like cotton that's previously washed without fabric softeners. All of that is fine. And then PFAS-free laboratory water should be used for field blanks and decontamination as well. I would like to just note, I guess, that PFAS-free decontaminated decon detergents can contain 1,4-dioxane, which is another still emerging contaminant that is not of no consequence. So I think if you're dealing with a site that could have multiple possible contaminants, you do still need to be cognizant of other things that we could be dealing with. And so you don't want to go with something just because it's PFAS free if 1,4-dioxane is a contaminant of concern at your site as well. And then also field quality control measures. These are standard, tried and true. We still do it, and maybe more so for PFAS. It's a collection of equipment blanks and field blanks, just to make sure that our decontamination measures, our ambient site conditions, and all of those things aren't inadvertently contaminating our samples. The analytical options are getting better. We've had a lot of development over the past few years beyond method 537.1, which is a drinking water method that labs have used as a basis for developing other methods that they can analyze non-potable drinking water, soil, and other things. So, but it isn't an EPA method for anything other than drinking water. EPA did issue a draft method 1633, which there have been a number of webinars about, so maybe you've caught one of those, but once it's finalized, that'll provide an analytical method for all of the other non-drinking water media. There's also method 533, which is another drinking water method that analyzes more 25 PFAS, but it's limited to short chain compounds. And then there are also two not yet EPA methods that are used in the overall assessment of a site for the total oxidizable precursor assay, or TOPA, and then TOF, which is total organic fluorine. These help you understand that universe, that black mass of PFAS that's around at a site. So, if we can measure for 25 PFAS with 533, I mentioned at the beginning that there's 4 to 10,000 PFAS compounds that we know of. So how do you understand what that 10,000 minus 25, what that black mass is? You can use TOPA and TOF to help figure that out. DoD does have ELAP accreditation in the QSM 5.3 table B15 as well. So that's something that needs to be incorporated into any work. And then a quick slide on risk assessment. There's, even if we were only looking at around 4,700 PFAS compounds, there's still only a very small number of those that actually have approved toxicity values. And they're developed by different organizations, whether it's a state, a federal agency, international agencies, but the derivation of those toxicity values can change, even though they might be looking at the same limited number of toxicity studies. And the reason for that is because of the way those calculations are done. You can add in certain safety factors and uncertainty factors as well. And so even though, again, they're looking at the same studies, they might develop significantly different numbers. And those values will also change the more studies that are issued. And it's important to note too that even if a toxicity value is issued by one agency, it might not be accepted by another because of differences in how it was actually calculated. And then, moving on into the consensus, that's where it gets a little challenging, is because there's not a lot of data and there's not a lot of consistency on the data that's found, and so the risk assessments can get really challenging. Although you are able to do site-specific risk assessments with the data that's available, and so that's something that's important to consider in your site investigations. The other sort of underlying, I guess, topic that you might think about in all of this is that exposures can occur on and off a site. So if you're doing a site-specific risk assessment at an installation, we're also all exposed to PFAS in our home lives as well. So how can you incorporate that information or not into your site-specific risk assessment? Those are all important things to consider. And as always, communication is really a key process in any project dealing with any kind of contaminant, but especially PFAS, which is so common in the news today, and the fear factor is quite high for it. So being able to communicate effectively with your stakeholders, your community members, having that transparent exchange of information is also really important. Oh, great. Treatment technologies. There are what I would call three primary categories of treatment technologies. The conventional technologies are those that have been demonstrated and they might be in wide use at various sites. We have some that are maybe demonstrated under specific conditions or have limited applications. And then developing technologies that are not yet demonstrated or haven't had a full field scale application yet. And the key component here, the big takeaway is I would let you know that most conventional technologies that are widely in use are going to be ex situ treatment technologies. When we're looking at treating any kind of liquid waste stream, the big hitters are carbon. Granular activated carbon is a big one. Ion exchange is a big one. And those are your sorption technologies. So they're binding to the PFAS compounds. They're not destroying them. And then membrane filtration, the same thing. It's like a reverse osmosis system. I have one under my sink in my kitchen. You might have one as well. It's basically a partially permeable membrane that's just really effective at removing PFAS, but downside of that is that there's a lot of reject water, which actually just in a environmental capacity, you then have to treat that reject water. You have coagulation, foam fractionation. Those are technologies that have been full-scale demonstrated outside of the US primarily. And then novel sorbents like clay and polymers. You have oxidation and biotreatment as well. So those are some that are still coming up the ladder as far as applicability and widespread use. Treatment options for solids, soil, sediments, things like that. Capping and disposal, incineration, those are your widespread conventional technologies. I should note, though, that there is a moratorium on incineration by DoD under the NDAA. So there is no incineration happening for DoD waste streams. There's also issues with disposal, as well as finding a facility that can and will take PFAS waste. So that can be a challenge. We also have some developing technologies or those that have been mostly developed and in some capacity and use include stabilization, again, with clays, segregation and soil washing, which is a way to wash the soil and then treat that concentrated waste stream with some other method mentioned before on the liquid slide. And then thermal desorption and biopiles are some that are developing as well. So you can see a lot of these are still getting into the ex situ treatment technology, which means you have to get it out, the waste out of the ground first. And looking at some in situ options, these are obviously, if you look at the implementation level here on the right, nothing that would be considered demonstrated and conventional, but definitely some promising technologies that are in play here. In situ sequestration, which is probably the furthest along out of all of these, using colloidal activated carbon. So it's an even finer carbon material than you would use in a water treatment system. And that's really used to prevent the migration of a PFAS plume. Again, it's not destroying the PFAS, it's just preventing it from reaching a sensitive receptor like a public water supply well or something like that. In situ thermal desorption and smoldering, those are going to be your thermally derived treatment technologies. Chemical oxidation, we use that an in situ chemical oxidation for chlorinated solvents. So trying to figure out if there are some oxidizers that can treat PFAS effectively is undergoing. And then in situ foam fractionation is another opportunity for in situ. But again, these are mostly in development. And then your IDW, your investigation-derived waste, looking at incineration and thermal regeneration. So you're going to use a GAC system or a resin system to bind and trap that PFAS onto that media, but then you have to treat that media. And so that might be regenerated or something like that. But again, there's the DoD moratorium in the NDAA. And then other technologies like plasma, hydrothermal, sonochemical, electrochemical, all some really cool looking technologies that are being tested in some capacity. And just a quick word on water treatment, because this is probably the most commonly applied technologies that we're looking at when we're dealing with the initial risk reduction, right? So we know we have PFAS in the aquifer. We know that we have impacted drinking water supplies, and we have to protect those receptors. So the easy button, and I use that knowing that it's not always that easy, is to use GAC ion exchange or reverse osmosis, but they all have their pros and cons. So sometimes you want to put them in, maybe all of them in some capacity, or a combination of GAC and resin in some capacity, so that you can capitalize on the pros and cons of each of these technologies to really put together the most not only effective for treatment, but also cost effectiveness and disposal costs and space limitations and things like that. So they all have their time and their place, I guess is what I would say. All right. And I mentioned before that going way back, feels like forever ago, I was talking about AFFF and the opportunity to find a fluorine-free alternative. I mentioned that the DoD still requires AFFF according to mil-spec requirements, but the Navy is actually revising specifications to ensure that they have a PFAS-free foam alternative, and that should be available by October of 2023. Right now, the fluorine-free foams don't contain PFAS, but they also don't meet mil-spec, so they can't be used at any DoD installation. But the foams that are in use at civil airports also must meet the mil-spec requirements under FAA. So there's a lot of other applications where the mil-spec requirements are impacting even non-military installations. The most, I guess, I did skip this here. Legacy PFAS containing AFFF is no longer manufactured. That's your 3M light water material. It's not manufactured anymore, and the current fluorotelomere foams will include those shorter chain PFAS compounds that move more rapidly in groundwater, but they don't contain PFOA and PFAS. They just contain different smaller chain versions of PFAS. So as facilities start moving to these F3 or fluorine-free foams, you have to be careful about how you're making that conversion, whether you're going to scrap the AFFF system completely and put in a new one is great, but might not be realistic or cost effective. So when you're converting that fire suppression system, you have to make sure that you properly decontaminate the old system to get rid of the AFFF that's in there. Normal flushing isn't going to do the trick, but you can add things like flocculants that'll form an ionic bond and help flush that PFAS containing AFFF out of there faster, and reduce the amount of waste that you generate in doing that decontamination. Any questions? I'm in full screen here, so I can't see.
Thanks, Lisa. This is Bill Giuseppe. Rick was going to sort of lead the Q&A as the moderator, but his audio went out, so
no.
Apparently he can't chime in. We have one question in the Q&A, Lisa, and it is, are any states considering air regulation, especially since you mentioned California and certain industries there? So what can you say about air regs?
Yeah, I know there are a lot of states that are working on a lot of different regulations. There's some work happening in Pennsylvania to look at different regulations there. Incineration has been banned in New York, and there are states that have guidance values but not regulations. So I don't know if that answers your question completely. The answer is never easy with PFAS, but and maybe Bill has a more direct answer than I do, but I would say that regulations for all media are coming if they're not there already.
Yeah, there's a little bit in the roadmap about
Mhm.
emphasizing air going forward, for sure. Okay, another question is, have there been any recent studies specific to PFAS that demonstrate health effects, or is the process still relying on the assumption that its structure resembles other compounds that have demonstrated health effects? So fundamentally, what are the PFAS specific information that we're having related to health effects?
Um, Correct me if I'm wrong, Bill, but I think there are studies specific to PFAS that demonstrate health effects, but the majority of them have been done on animals, and so they're using this I forget what it's called off the top of my head, this conversion factor to correlate what it does to animals to humans. And then what you're talking about with relying on the structure, they're also trying to apply those toxicity studies on the compounds that they have and correlating it to other PFAS compounds of similar structures. Um, so that's what I know. I don't know, Bill, if you have any other info.
Not real. I guess the only two things. One is if you've seen the movie Dark Waters, which was a Hollywood version of PFAS, this PFAS story, they talk about the public health poll and health survey that they did in Parkersburg, West Virginia. So I think 60,000 people had their blood sampled and health effects evaluated for PFOA, one compound. So that's another sort of data set. The only other thing related to risk assessment I might mention is if you're going to JETSI, the Joint Engineer Training Conference coming up in a few weeks, there is a talk on what are called new approach methods, which are ways to get at this toxicity question without having to do rat studies or something for each and every one of the thousands of compounds.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, another question is, are military bases addressing their own issues on their own, or is this being handled at a higher level by service or by DoD?
Yes.
Yeah, I was about to say a little of each, it seems.
Yeah. Yeah, it
Yeah,
is a little bit of each.
yeah, I think the Air Force AFCAC seemed to handle it programmatically so far. The Navy is kind of programmatic. The Corps of Engineers seems to be a little more ad hoc, I'd say. But yeah, that's a good answer, Lisa. Okay, when you mentioned that not necessarily longer chained carbon fluorine bonds are worse to the environment, is there not a trend? I thought that longer chained carbon fluorine typically means higher energy required to break the bond. So I guess if you could speak to a little bit about long versus short chain compounds, how they behave, and perhaps their toxicity.
Yeah, so I'm not sure I'm going to answer I'm not sure I understand the question totally, so I'm going to do my best to answer it. But um, I think what this comment is going back to is when I said that the shorter chain compounds are not necessarily better. Um, when we're talking about replacements and the different formulations of things, and while it might be PFOA and PFOS or the C8 compounds free, it might be a C6 or something else instead. And so what we're finding though is that those compounds aren't necessarily better for the environment. They still don't break down, they still persist. So that's where I was going with that. I think the relative levels of whether or not a long chain or a short chain compound is worse or better in the environment is so minute that you can't really say that definitively.
Yeah,
But go ahead.
and I was just going to say, I think there's some evidence that the shortest chains, the fours, the PFBA or BS, are less toxic than the longer chains, but I don't know that it is exactly linear. In other words,
Right.
I don't know that we've got enough evidence yet to say that short is always better or long is
Right.
always worse.
And I hear too that the shorter chain compounds aren't as toxic or at the same concentrations, but again, we're talking about parts per trillion here. So um, to get to those toxic levels, you're just dealing with a higher concentration of a shorter chain compound.
Yep.
I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, if there's any other questions, put them in the Q&A. One question I was going to ask is, we see reference to C6 or people talk about short and long chain. Was there really a benefit to the DoD transferring or shifting everything from C8 to C6 that they did over the last couple of years? What's your opinion of that process that they changed from C8 to C6 foams?
I mean, overall, it's a step in the right direction, right? Because you're still making your way towards something better, whether it ends up being the fluorine-free foam or not. And it's all part of that phase out process as well, and reducing our overall risk and what those bioaccumulation levels, bioaugmentation levels, and things like that. So I think it's really important to do the risk reduction as well.
Okay. Yeah, I think so. So a couple more questions came in. One looks quite philosophical, but let's go with the first one. First one is, we've been discussing human toxicity. Are there any generally accepted human toxic health effects? If so, what are they?
Yeah, so the effects that I've seen in literature are hypertension, preeclampsia, certain types of cancers, um, increase in liver enzymes and things like that. So there are some documented health effects, but um, I don't have that whole list
Yeah, and it's being
right now.
developed.
Yeah.
I mean, you're spot on, and we're learning more all
Every
the time.
day.
I guess I can't imagine how much money is being poured into toxicity research right now. We don't see that because we're in the environmental side necessarily, but
Very rarely do we get to see that.
yeah. So now this is the sort of philosophical question. And actually, Lisa, if you get yourself out of full screen mode and
I
read
just
this,
did.
yeah, because it's lengthy and I think it's a good one. I think it's a great question actually. So why don't let's all read that a moment, and then you can speak to that.
Hmm.
I see a COVID correlation here.
Yeah. No, I
Actually,
mean that's a great question. Actually, we're just within my own company, we've been talking about that as well. I I don't disagree with it. I think there is a lot of panic around it. There's a lot of public perception, or not public perception, public involvement, and I think that's good because you do want some of that pressure. Bill, before we started, you mentioned that you've never seen a specific contaminant outlined and specifically in the NDAA, but PFAS is, and I think part of that is the public outrage about it. Again, we've known about PFAS since the 1930s. We knew it was an issue going way back, and we're only just now starting to regulate it. So um, there are some benefits to that panic that's happening. And I don't think that we're going to be able, I personally don't think that we're going to be able to remediate everything down to background, right? Because background means that it doesn't exist anymore because it's a man made contaminant. But we are going to have to do the remediation that we need to do to eliminate those source areas at our installations, at our airports, at our fire stations, you know, all of those places, because we know that we can't drink it for our lifetime and not be affected by it. So I think there is a middle ground that's going to happen. It's just we're on this pendulum that's, I don't know if we've reached the height of it yet.
Yeah. Okay, so we need to button it up. We got 1 minute left. There are a couple other questions, which I'm not sure how we're going to deal with those, but we wanted to make sure that we have an opportunity to remind everybody there's a handout. A recording of this webinar will be available on SAMI's YouTube channel, and we're also going to have an IGE page on the SAMI environmental page online, so we'll be able to get information for that. A PDH certificate will be emailed to attendees within 2 days. And then if you're not registered yet, you're not planning on going or whatever, or if you are, the SAMI JETSI Expo and Training Conference is in a couple weeks, May 10th to the 12th in Aurora, Colorado, kind of in my backyard. There are some PFAS topics there, but there are a lot of other environmental and other topics. So appreciate everybody's participation in this and great questions. And we're going to strive for that. It's an educational thing. So if you have questions, please feel free to ask them. And actually, let me go back a couple slides so you have an email address for both Lisa and myself. You're free to send us questions and we'll provide answers if we can. Thank you very much. I believe that's it.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Lisa. Excellent job.